Buenas tardes. You've already stretched your hands out to the front. I've been sitting with you for a while. If somebody in front of you know, give them a massage. You know. So I'm elated to be here. As Juan said, one of my former students used to work with me when I was on campus as the director of the MESA program. I'm the director of strategic diversity, recruitment, and transfer initiative programs at UC Davis. I was brought on board and recruited by our assistant vice chancellor, Walter Robinson, who used to be our director of admissions here, and our vice chancellor, Adela de la Torre, who's now the president of San Diego State, to lead our HSI initiative, our Chicano Latino recruitment. And during that time, because of our success, they've also asked me now to oversee our African American recruitment efforts, our Native American recruitment efforts, as well as our transfer programs. So I'm elated to be there. I'm blessed to have this position, but I bleed blue and gold. So I hope this isn't on camera. You know, I'm a golden bear. You know, I love this institution. I'm going to give you a little bit of what we do, but I can't give you the secret sauce, because then you guys can beat us out. Because we really, really cannot compete with the #1 public university in the country. But you know what? We're beating you to the punch. And we're doing a better job of recruiting Chicano Latinos at UC Davis in a different way. We can't compete with the name recognition. You have a 45% yield rate. Ours is about 27 to 29, depending on the year. Kids are going to come here because of the yield rate. But there's some startling facts before I begin the formal presentation. Is this year you have 13,884 Chicano Latino students that applied to UC Berkeley. 13,884, that's a significant number. How many did Little Davis get, which was a satellite of UC Berkeley? 16,865. There's no way that UC Davis should have more applications than UC Berkeley. But yes, because I'm taking care of business. And our own team, right? And we are doing an excellent job of recruiting, and that's what my presentation will be today. But here's the big issue that UC Berkeley has to grapple with. UCLA, 22,246 Chicano Latino apps. 8,000 more students check the box for UCLA than check the box for UC Berkeley. That's a significant issue. That's a recruitment issue. And so I'm going to do, only got a few minutes, but I'm going to kind of break my presentation into 4 major areas. So I was asked to come to Davis to help us reach HSI status by 2020. And I'm elated to say that in fall 2018, our undergraduate enrollment was over 25%. So we reached that 2 years ahead of schedule. And so that's probably why I'm here today. You know, and it's been pretty exciting to do that. But it's also been a commitment from the university, and a commitment in very different ends. And I'm telling you, like a commitment we have right now for our African American initiative. We have 4.2% of our students are African American. Walter Robinson, that was his last speech. He was so excited about moving that way. And I said that by 2022, we will be 6% African American students at UC Davis. I guarantee you that. This spring, we're having a reception for all African American admitted freshmen. Another reception for all African American transfer students. Guess where that's at? At the chancellor's residence, at his house. Our chancellor is African American. You get an African American parent to go to his house? Last time we did this, he was there, one of the women said from Richmond, and we stole her from Berkeley at the end of the day. Is he really your chancellor? She could not believe there was an African American in the UC system. But that's the kind of commitment we have from the chancellor on down. This past Saturday, the chancellor was a keynote at one of our student conferences that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So I broke up my presentation into 4 major categories just because of the short time that I have. I'm going to really do a nuts and bolts presentation and really just provide you what we've done to move the marker in Chicano Latino enrollment. Community engagement, #1. Second one is what is our strategic recruitment plan? What is our strategic yield plan? And comprehensive retention services. Because it doesn't do us any good to bring in a significant number of Chicano Latino students to UC Davis if they don't graduate. We will be under 25% in no time. So the only way to do that is to make sure that I partner with and work with our retention center across the board. So what are some of the things that we do for our strategic community engagement? This Saturday, we were the platinum sponsor for the Steps to College conference at the Mexican consulate in Sacramento. That means that we put our money where our mouth is, and we donated $10,000 to that event. Platinum sponsor. When you walk into the Mexican consulate, you'll see Davis, brochures all over the place. It helps that the Council General is an Aggie. So, but we are there in a very, very, very loud manner. If you look at the big, huge boards all around, it's all about Davis. Who did the keynote this year? Our Chancellor. We also sponsor every year, made a commitment to Puente. And we sponsor the Puente Leadership Conference. We sponsor the Puente Motivational Conference. So every year, we're going to have 1,000 young Chicano Latinos, for the most part, on our campus visiting us. How much does that cost us? $10,000 every year. And we've committed to that, and I'm glad my Puente colleagues are here, Julia and Jane. They can attest to it, I'm not making it up. So every year, we sponsor a conference. We're already planning out for 2020. We already have our dates, we have the money. And we pick up half the tab on those conferences. That's UC Davis's money. When I came to Davis, I said, if we really want to engage and bring Chicano Latino students, it has to be a place that they want to come. It has to be a place that, I want to go look at all the stuff that's going on. To engage the community. Without that presence, students are not going to come. Not to Davis. And then you guys have other issues to deal with here at Berkeley. It's an Asian institution. It's all white, it's all Asian, it's all nerds, all kinds of, I went to Berkeley, so I know it. You can see it when you walk around. So you guys have different issues. Number one is that we need to show the Chicano Latino community in the greater Sacramento area and in the Bay Area that we're committed to Chicano Latino issues across the board, not just about school. We also host what we call STEM Transfer Day through our MESA program, and we invite community colleges students to come up. We also host Discover Davis, and we invite 22 community colleges to bring up their students to spend the day with us, and we're really introducing them to Davis the year before they apply. We also hold VIP visits, and we commit $10,000 to host any program that calls my office, Migrant Ed, Upper Bound, EAOP. Puente takes the majority of that, because Puente will send 34 Puente programs to visit our campus. And we've modified our admissions presentation to really focus on helping students deal with issues of academic inferiority. They think about themselves, how they think about themselves, also to help them develop their social capital, understanding about the university. So we've developed a presentation that's just not the generic one that we get, because that's not going to help your Puente students. It's not going to motivate them to come. We have things that are about them in that presentation. We have a profile of a Latino student and a Latina student that looks like them, where they could see that. The issues that we had when I got there, after I did all this presentation, we turned around and all the tour advisors were white or Asian. So I'm telling them how diverse they are, how much we want them here, and then our institution has not changed who are those tour guides. So we've had a discussion about that. We need to diversify our tour guides, because students didn't believe me that there were students of color on campus. But we have $10,000 when a program comes in and requests a tour of our campus, we pull it, and we'll call the Upper Bound director, that Migrant Ed director, say, we want to make your visit a VIP visit. What does that mean? We're going to host you for lunch. We're going to pay for your lunch at the dining commons. That's $1,000 if you have 1,200 students. And we do that over and over. We had over 60 programs come from throughout the state. We have programs from as far down as San Ysidro will come up. And before, they wouldn't go to Davis. They'd come to Berkeley. And what they say after they get done at Davis, we love you guys. And what I tell them, all the UCs like you. They all want you to come there, but only one loves you, Davis. I said, who's feeding you the lunch? You gotta pay for your own lunch down the street at Berkeley. Sorry, but that's true. That's what I gotta tell them. And then we also participate in the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities. And we are so much into really trying to advertise ourselves at at San Diego. When they had the big, huge conference during the opening ceremony, we were acknowledged as moving towards HSI status. With thousands and thousands of people in that audience, that put Davis on a whole different pedestal. Folks that hadn't even thought about encouraging their students to apply to Davis, all were saying, hey, you should consider Davis. You should consider Davis. And the more I hear that, the more it makes me think that we're doing the right job. It's much more than just recruitment. You have to be committed to the entire community, the Chicano Latino community. Unless you're doing that, you're going to stand up in the same place you are right now, and UCLA is going to beat you all the time. And if Davis beats you, there's something wrong. There's no way Sleepy Town Davis, population 65,000 people, with more cows than P students, No, it doesn't. I better be quiet. Hopefully nobody's recording me. I'm gonna get in trouble when I go back. Now, a little bit about our strategic recruitment. When I first got to Davis, what I wanted to do is identify the top Chicano Latino feeder high schools to the UC system, not to UC Davis. I wanted to know where are students applying to. And what many recruiters do, and admissions do, they shy away from low-performing schools. No, why are we going to go there?
That's right.
Go to Calexico High School. 99.9% Chicano Latino. They got 2 Asians. Literally, it's on the border, but they have 2 AP calculus classes. They have an AP physics class. We pull about a dozen students from that school every single year. So if I have 10 schools like that, that's 120. If I have 20 schools that I'm working like Calexico, that's 240. All I need is 1,600 Chicano Latinos for our freshman class. And from 20 schools, I can pull 240. Boom, you're over that threshold. We started working in Salinas. We went to Everett Alvarez and Alison. And Pablo will attest to this when we've done UC Santa Cruz numbers. We used to have about 20 to 30 apps from Alison High School in Salinas. This year we have 108. We will be bringing 20 students from Alison to UC Davis in the fall. Everett Alvarez in the hood. Who do they call to come and do a presentation? They call UC Davis if they need some for their juniors or seniors. I mean, I've seen like I'm there like every single month or one of my staff members. We've really now captured Salinas and we expanded that recruitment model from King City to Castroville. And we sent a letter to every single principal that you've been selected to be part of UC Davis's strategic diversity recruitment. And somebody will be contacted because you're a special school. And we want to bring your students to our. So now Mesa, Upper Bound, Puente, Gear Up, they're all bringing their students on their dime for our VIP days. And we pay for lunch. Our recruitment strategy is working well in the Salinas Valley, across the board. So we needed to identify high schools and really change the mindset of not going to underperforming schools. There are great students at those schools. Why only go to the top performing schools? Where you're gonna find 10 Chicanos that are gonna be Latino students. Go to another school like Alexis, find 20. So we had to rethink how we were doing our business. Then I had to really do an analysis of the applications, the admits, and the SIRs. Number 1, we had a task to increase apps. That's Berkeley's biggest challenge now. Yep. Number 2, to be able to increase our yield rate. To be able to increase our yield rate was going to be critical. And then number 3, to make sure that they graduated here at the end of the day. We also added a couple strategic areas that I thought were being untouched by UC Davis. In Imperial County, Ventura County, where I grew up, farm worker kid from Oxnard, and then Salinas region. And those 3 areas alone has allowed us to bring in over 300 students. That is a tipping point for us to become an HSI. If it wasn't for our strategic plan, we would have never been in those areas in the way we are now. I was down in Imperial County this week, and I was speaking at a career fair. I was the only college there. I had a gold mine. I got 2,000 students, and I'm the only university talking besides the community college. Where are all those kids gonna apply? UC Davis. I even beat out UC San Diego in their own backyard. Stealth mode came in, came out, boom. And those applicants are there. On the way over here this morning, I got a call from a student that has some issues with their application. My business cards has my personal cell phone. She called me because she needs help. And I said, I'll take care of you, Davis, don't worry about it. We'll take care of your test issues. But I can't do anything for you at UCLA, at Berkeley, or San Diego. You're on your own, So who's she gonna call? She's gonna call some 800 number and gonna say, call back in 3 weeks. We're busy right now, can't call you back. Right. That student from Calexico High School is coming to UC Davis, even if Berkeley admits her, because I took care of her. I guarantee you that. For UC Davis, most of our students that are applying are from the San Francisco, LA, and Orange County. You look at Chicano Latino apps, it flips. It's LA, San Francisco, and the Inland Empire. That means we couldn't do our traditional recruitment models that were focused on San Francisco, LA, and Orange County if we really wanted to increase the number of Chicano Latinos. We need to rethink that and spend more resources in Los Angeles. We're doing okay in San Francisco because we have name recognition here, and really spend some time in the Inland Empire. The Inland Empire caught my attention. I did not really think that we were going to have that huge of a number of students applying. Particularly, this is for Chicano Latinos. And guess what else? For African Americans. Yes. Yep. Not necessarily for whites and Anglos. but for Chicano Latinos and African Americans. Now our strategic yield activities. I don't know if you guys probably can't see these. So we do a variety of things. We have, after we admit students, we go back to their homes and we do a family meet and greet. And we invite the entire family to come and spend time with us. And we don't just limit it to the mom and dad, we invite the entire familia. Bring your siblings, I want to recruit the next class already. You know, bring your little cousins. It's all about familia. And then we have bilingual meet and greets. Well, we found that students and parents were not coming because our presentations were monolingual Spanish. And even if we promoted them with Spanish names on there, Guerrero and Garcia, so we said, you know what, let's be very intentional. So in LA, in Southern California, we're having two different meet and greets, a general meet and greet and a bilingual meet and greet. And we're also doing that in Salinas and in Imperial County and Los Angeles. So very intentional to involve the whole family unit. And we do very strategic things. Everybody gives everybody swag. The priority for us is get swag to the mom. Give swag to the jefita. If you want to get it, you better give her something. You know, she's going to make the decision when you get home. Your moms love me. They all got UC Davis grocery bags. They got pamitas. They got a little bit of stuff to put on the fridge. And so we thought about this from a culturally sensitive place. It just can't be the generic things that we do. And so we have a separate table where we send moms and dads to go check in. Besides, here's the student check-in. There's a, pero yo qué, yo no sé nada. Aquí, señorita, venga para acá, tenemos un regalito. Ay, qué muchacho más lindo. Sounds like my grandma telling me what a wonderful guy I am. Then we have Aggie Senior Weekend. We fly in 250 students from Southern California for the weekend. And we actually do that with our Student Recruitment and Retention Center. They take care of everything for a huge decision day. And we found out that many Chicano Latinos, their parents are not going to drive them from San Diego, from the Inland Empire, from LA, from San Fernando Valley, from Ventura County, from Salinas, from Fresno, from Bakersfield, to come to UC Davis's decision day. Ain't going to happen. None of them are coming. So we fly them up, and we pay for everything. We pay for shuttles, we pay for the transportation, and then we work all the details out with our Student Recruitment Retention Center, and they find the freshmen to host them. And we turn them over to them on Friday. They come and spend the day with us at Decision Day, the big old open house, like Cal Day here. And then we pick them up on Sunday morning, a little torn, a little tired. We get them back to the airport and we fly them home. And then we decided we also we couldn't bring enough students for that day. So now we have the Aggie Day Trip. And we'll fly in another 200 students for one day to visit our campus and fly them back overnight. And we do the same thing for our transfer students. And then we have something called Experience Davis, which is a family weekend. For Imperial County and for Salinas, I found that unless we bring the parents, there's not going to be any game changer back home. At that kitchen table, they're going to think that they need to stay there. And so we bring in parents. The last 2 years, we brought in 20 families. What's our yield rate? 90%. 90% of the families we bring in from Salinas will actually come to UC Davis. 90%. And one mom told me, mira, yo creía que era bien peligroso la universidad, pero aquí está bien tranquilo. I thought university was very dangerous, but Davis is very, very peaceful. My daughter is coming here, #1 student from Soledad High School. Nice. And so we brought her. The year before, she did not allow her daughter to leave because she thought it was so dangerous. #1 student. She's at Hartnell College right now. So building that social capital of working with the entire family unit. And then we have transfer weekends, and for strategic communications, we have Brown Pages, which is a booklet about all of our different resource centers on campus for Chicano Latinos. We have one-page cultural flyers. We have different videos. We have different videos. I'm not going to show it to you. We have about 6 different videos of different students that strategic communication has done for us. There's one of my students that I recruited from El Centro. He's actually a migrant ed kid. He's doing research. And there's him in his lab with other Chicano Latinos, engineering, doing research, studying together. And so for the university to give us that, it makes my job so much easier. And have that kind of level of publications, this kind of level of activities. And then we have other things that we do to make sure our students come. We have anti-melt events. I actually have designed a college 101 class after our students' SIR. I'm afraid the students might still be afraid to come to campus. So I go back and we actually teach a class and we host a dinner for their parents. And I walk them through all the fears they're going to go through. And we talk about you need to get your son or daughter a credit card. You might not have one, but they're going to need it to buy books. You know, open up a checking account. You might not have one, but your son or daughter needs one. We talk about flying on SWA, Southwest Airlines. We talk about generating points. We talk about finals. We talk about they're not going to call you anymore. Learn how to text. All these different things with parents. And we have like an hour-and-a-half class that we do with those parents. And then we have, once we get to campus, my colleagues do a tremendous job in terms of our retention efforts. So we have a fall bienvenida for all Chicano Latino freshmen. And then I host, with the director of the Chicano Latino Retention Center, regional welcomes for students. So we'll have a dinner with all the kids from Imperial County. And I invite all the juniors and seniors to come and meet with them and share their experiences of the journey through going through Davis. So all the engineers will get together and the seniors will tell the freshmen what their experiences was. And then we have all the letters of science, all the agricultural students together. And then we also have all the students in the biological science. Very rich couple hours, and the students then find out about the centro. The most important for our students, they need to have a sense of casa, of familia. And many students tell us, the reason I'm here at Davis, because when I came, I felt familia. And I'm in shock, because that's what we've been proposing, but that's what students are telling us now. I felt familia. So we have all kinds of student retention centers on our campus. All of these different ones, because many of our students are multiracial, are extremely important. If our institution fails to fund these adequately and do all the work needed, our recruitment and our yield will drop tremendously. Because students need to see that we're committed to all these different students. So it's really important that an institution fund all these different programs. We have a Chicano Latino Retention Center. So it got kind of cut off, but that's basically our centro. And they do a lot of great things every Wednesday morning, 9 o'clock, pan dulce and chocolate. And it gets packed. And then 10 o'clock, they go into academic support. So we really have a very comprehensive piece. We have an undocumented student center as well, which I'm the proudest of. And anytime I say that we have an undocumented student center, an AB 540 center, that puts me in a different pedestal. Because if you don't have one, and you can't talk about who the director is and what you're doing at that center, students are not going to believe you, that you're really committed to them. Because many of our students are undocumented. So it's really important to be able to have that. In closing, a little bit of data. 2013, before we started our initiative, our freshman enrollment was 20%. 2018, our freshman enrollment is 31.2. We have on campus more Chicano Latino freshmen than we do white Anglo freshmen. We've tipped that scale. We've tipped that scale. And a lot of it has to do because of our recruitment efforts. And it has to do because of very aggressive yield efforts. But people are going to say, oh, Davis is doing it through affirmative action. They're letting all them brown faces in, right? Because they got all these people, they're not really top-notch students. You're more likely to be admitted to Davis if you're white, 49%. Chicano Latinos, only 31%. So that myth doesn't hold true. You're still going to be more challenged because most Chicano Latino students are going to go to the lowest performing schools. We only admit 31%. Our overall admit rate is 43%. For whites, it's 49%. But look at our yield rate. Overall, 19% of the students that we admit come to Davis. Freshman class, 27% of the students. We still can't compete with Berkeley. What's UC Berkeley's yield rate? 45%. We can't compete with that, but we are competing because we're getting so many more apps. We're getting so many more applications. There's no way that Berkeley should be second fiddle to our baby bear down the street in LA. I'm like Walter Robinson, there's baby bear, man, they're baby, they're not even a real bear. We're a golden bear, we're baby bears. You know, there is no way that they should have more apps than UC Berkeley. I mean, that's going to be the tipping point. You got to increase apps, and you got to put a more aggressive recruitment effort and fund yield activities. Strategic recruitment, to strategic yield, to strategic intervention. This is what it's all about. It's those three phases. The most important one, though, needs to begin with community engagement. And this is as simple. When I was here, our dean of students was Francisco Hernandez, still one of my mentors, my main mentor. And he started something at Zellerbach called Culturas Sin Fronteras. All kinds of Mexicano, Latin music. I don't see anything at Zellerbach that even interests me. When I was here, we used to have all kinds of Latino groups come to the Greek theater. The only time I hear music that's related to me is the Chicano graduation. That's it. Yeah. So the institution has changed. that commitment that we had when Francisco provided that leadership. You telling me how many culturally sensitive events that Chicano Latinos are happening at Zellerbach, at the Greek Theater. I'm happy to say last year I went to go see los Tigres del Norte at Mondavi's, at our Mondavi Center in Davis. Yes. We brought in los Tigres del Norte. Get them over here, play them at the Greek. You think that's not going to engage the community? Say, wow, look at Berkeley, look at all this stuff they're doing. When I do a presentation, say, man, my favorite group is los Tigres del Norte, and I saw them on campus last year. Whoa, my God, I'm going to Davis. And then, be culturally sensitive. Puro Aggies, una universidad especial. To have this to a bilingual parent or monolingual Spanish parent, it's going to pique their interest in our institution. So, thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. We are your Bruin friends from the South. And I actually wanted to talk about 3 critical dimensions of this because I imagined my task a little differently, which was, what if I could get an audience with Chancellor Block at UCLA? What would I want to call to his attention? And so I think there are really 3 things: politics, pedagogy, and perspectives or perceptions. Beginning with the politics, about a year ago there was a student who wrote a piece in the Daily Bruin, and she called on UCLA to apply for HSI designation. And about a year before that, UCI achieved its status as an HSI, and there was a really glowing article in the LA Times about Irvine and its new status that reported that for the first time, Irvine had become the premier destination for Latinx students, surpassing UCLA, which had always been #1. And finally, Berkeley then made its announcement that in 10 years it expects to be an HSI. And so I think the competitive pressures are building to be intentional about becoming an HSI in the UC system. And so I think those pressures, however, weigh against what I think are a set of politics rooted in backlash. And that makes people timid about how to proceed. Everyone has noted that HSI status is based purely on an enrollment figure of 25%. And I think that that 25% figure begins to make people veer into some notion of a quota or affirmative action. And if I were the lawyer for one of these institutions, I would say, but wait a minute, this is not a quota, this is just a projection based on demographic trends in the applicant base, the applicant pool. But I also heard today from Davis and from UC Berkeley that they are making changes to their admissions process at about the same time that they're moving to HSI status, which I think will actually potentially complicate the narrative of HSI status. And we heard a little bit already about concerns that relate to the same kind of dynamics of affirmative action, dilution of merit, the lowering of standards, and the danger of displacement, which we haven't heard about, but the fears that somehow the students who had a sense of entitlement to be at UC campuses won't have the opportunity. And it's not just students. I was actually talking to a colleague about the transitions to HSI in this huge conference in San Diego, and I explained the gap between student enrollment and faculty and staff and leadership. And this white male colleague of mine turned to me and said, so basically what you're saying is they won't need people like me anymore. Mm-hmm. And I thought, first of all, that wasn't my point, but it was also an expression of a fear that people have that is there and will, I think, as more and more UCs become HSIs, as it reaches every sector of the UC system, will become more palpable. So one question is, how do we deal with politics through pedagogy? And we heard the term intentionality, and I think that that's very important, but it's not going to be easy to be intentional in the same way across different sectors of the academic system, the mission and operations of the institution. So beginning with student services, I see this as probably the least problematic area so long as resources are provided, because I don't think there's going to be resistance in the same way to having more services for students. And I think of this as services not just designated for Latinx students, but recognizing, for example, the incredible role that the UCs play for first-generation students across the board. So some of those basic areas. Another thing that we know is that many of these students will not have the same informal access to networks. I'm on an advisory board for a study of women of color in law schools. And it's really clear that these women are much more dependent on formal institutional services for everything from getting advice about their careers to getting jobs. So it's not just about like getting food and shelter, which have been issues on the campuses, but it's also about thinking about your future. And you can't go and ask your parents how to be a lawyer or how to be a doctor. And so we need to think about those services, which if improved will benefit all students. The other thing that was mentioned is a welcoming environment. And I think this issue of campus climate will be a significant one, but I also think many student organizations with more support are often able to do a leadership role in kind of creating these spaces of welcome, and Blas was talking about familia. So I think, those are areas where we're seeing progress. I think the curriculum will be trickier because of academic freedom, because faculty feel that they have a right to decide how to teach the class as long as it's on the designated subject matter. And so I think institutions will have to be a lot more strategic about incentivizing faculty to think about revising the curriculum. And so one question is whether, for example, innovation grants in the curriculum that address not just the Latinx, but the change in the demography of California, its implications for politics, for public services, for climate change, for a whole range of issues, would be a tremendously exciting opportunity. But I don't think the faculty will do it unless they feel that they're supported in it with, and I have to say this, tangible resources. So I think that's a very different area. Finally, faculty, staff, and senior leadership, I do think that's going to be another tricky area. Because of the fears of displacement I've already described, but also because when it's students, we always say getting them in the door isn't enough, we have to support them after they're there. We don't tend to say that for people who become leaders, who are anomalous in their identities. And so I've been looking at research on law firms, and corporate sectors also have this problem. But we know systematically, for example, with people of color, if you give someone a memo at a law firm and you say, this is from a white associate, they find far fewer mistakes than if you say this was written by an associate of color. It's dramatic how many more problems they find in the memo when they think it was written by a person of color. So there is that issue. There's also problems in firms of origination credit, where we don't give full credit to people who generate business if they're people of color. Or in team contributions, their contributions are systematically undervalued and eclipsed. And over time, that damages their ability to be leaders and to be promoted through the system. And so I think we ought to have the back of people who take on these responsibilities. Just the way we want students to flourish, we should have a similar commitment to our leaders, and we should be taking a page from the books of other sectors. I think we tend to think this is a problem for the private sector, but somehow we as academics are immune to all these phenomena. I don't think that's the case. Now, the other thing that I think about displacement is that it is actually a thinly veiled version of I'm afraid of decline and diminishing resources. And so I think that if you can show that these changes actually will help to generate resources, tremendous resources, that you will actually have a much easier case with respect to some of the other institutional changes you want. It's very interesting because the rise of the HSIs has been the one sector of growth in federal grants to higher education. So the first thing we know is that these federal grants are an amazing resource. But one thing that I think would be useful, and it's not just Berkeley or Davis or UCLA, but it's really a system-wide effort to go to the state and ask them to do some strategic investment in this transition. And I think that one way to do that would be to match the grants that campuses get to be an HSI or some portion of those grants, or to have a strategic effort to help to prepare for the transition, or finally to create more in the way of a cooperative database of resources on becoming an HSI. And so I think we have a hugely democratic legislature with a sympathetic governor and an active Latino caucus. It seems to me very useful for this, but I think it has to be a system-wide effort. The third area is corporate support. There has been a study done by David Hayes Bautista at UCLA called on Latino GDP. American corporations have been growing through 3 strategies, only one of which is sustainable. One of them is the growth in the Latino consumer base. The other is tax cuts, and the third is downsizing. You cannot downsize forever. You can't, apparently, some people think you can't do tax cuts forever, but you can benefit from the real sustained growth in the Latinx community, and a lot of corporations are interested in supporting Latinx-related activities. Foundation giving. This is another great opportunity, not because foundations are doing what they should now. Only about 2% of philanthropic funds go to Latinx-headed activities, but because it would be an opportunity to begin to educate foundations about these demographic changes and the need for investment with partners they're already comfortable with, the universities. Finally, of course, alumni donations, and here I really don't think it's just Latinx alumni. The Latinx community, for a variety of reasons, has not been that philanthropic, but there are people who, for example, are first generation. A lot of UC alums were the first in their family to go. When they were at the inception, I was the dean at UCLA. We had a huge cohort. It was very different from other law schools because it was first generation, self-made, and by the way, did very well because LA was coming into its own as a global city. And so I think you can make appeals for other kinds of investments that will also benefit the Latinx population. My third was, I talked about politics, I've talked about pedagogy. My third is perceptions. You will have a significant difficulty persuading people that this is going to work. And so thinking about timetables, benchmarks, and how to get the message out are going to be critical, because whatever the realities are, we know that perceptions matter, even when they're wildly off. If there's anything our recent political experience has taught us, it is that. And that there can be tremendous gaps between perception and reality. So I want to just say in conclusion that I think this is a tremendous opportunity for the UC system and for the campuses to lead. And if I were in Chancellor Block's office, I would share with him a story. Juan Cartagena is the head of Latino Justice Pearl Deaf, and he gave a talk on Latinos in the Northeast as part of this initiative that I'm co-directing. And he said, you know, the Puerto Rican population has declined in dominance. The Latinx population there is very heterogeneous. Once upon a time, New York was the center of a lot of Latinx leadership in law and policy, including, for example, bilingual ballots. But he said every Latinx community around the country is looking to California. Everybody believes that if it's going to happen in the right way, in the positive way, it's going to happen here. Who better to lead such an effort than the University of California? We can help our nation to achieve its destiny as a great democracy rooted in diversity and opportunity through these kinds of initiatives. The time is now, the opportunity is ours, let's not squander it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moran. Our next speaker is Dr. Pablo Reguerin, Associate Vice Chancellor for Student Achievement, Equity, and Innovation, and Director of EOP at UC Santa Cruz. Go Slugs. Dr. Reguerin oversees the UC Santa Cruz HSI initiatives and is Principal Investigator for 3 U.S. Department of Education HSI grants totaling $9 million. In 2017, Pablo completed a study comparing graduate students of color from public 4-year HSIs with non-HSIs. Let me just get you can't see my password, can you? Let me get you started here. There we go.
Thank you again. It's a pleasure to be here, and a lot of great comments were made today that I want to echo, and I will try to do. I'm looking more at the HSI issue in terms of the retention, graduation, and kind of on campus. but we have more work to do in the enrollment area. So first and foremost, we have defined our HSI initiative in terms of racial equity, a focus on racial equity. And actually, the way we've thought about it on our campus and through many, many conversations and symposia like this, was that we weren't terribly excited about the federal designation and even being called a Hispanic. But what we were excited about was the policy window that had opened up that now made institutional success critical in not just in terms of Latinos on the side, but like putting together and not being able to disconnect institutional success of UC Santa Cruz from Latinx student success and success overall. And so we really saw this as an opportunity to kind of ride the HSI train, but with a clear focus on racial equity at multiple levels. The other thing that we did is we thought about this issue that's come up, like how are you too Latinx, are you everybody? And I really like from Excellence in Education, one of the things that they say is, give yourself permission to be unapologetically Latinx focused while serving all communities. And that you can have both. And not to get tied into this 1970s, 1980s kind of diversity, compositional diversity focus, where you're counting how many of this and how many of the other. So we really put that aside and said, we're going to make a better UC Santa Cruz where Latinx students can thrive that will also benefit all communities. And I think that was really important. We also thought it was important to connect this change in demographics, as people talk about, with rejecting a deficit perspective. Because in higher education and education overall, culturally we are deficit-minded. Many of us went to schools in a deficit-minded culture. We carry that, it's invisible, it can be entrenched in the way that we work. And so we had to be very vigilant and call each other and make sure that we were not perpetuating a deficit-oriented mindset that promotes the very racist outcomes that we see in the lack of equity. We also really took on and used the work of Estela Ben-Simon and Alicia Dowd around the equity scorecard and using data to out the racial inequity that we had on our campus, that sometimes our own systems and the way that we teach and the way that we provide funding perpetuated. And so a lot of folks had just not seen some of the data. When we initially started, people were concerned about disaggregating data by race, and we said it was imperative that we disaggregate the data by race, and we can look at other areas as well. But it was critical that we did that, and oftentimes people were unaware of the racial disparities. Or if they looked at them, they'd only looked at retention and graduation, and had not looked at GPA, had not looked at outcomes for specific courses, for gateway areas. And so we really use this kind of three-step approach, which is you do the data inquiry, you do the data mining, disaggregated by race to out racial issues. The second part is you reflect on those and you think about what are the systems that are contributing to those outcomes. Keep in mind, without blaming the students, so we're rejecting the deficit perspective, right? And then third, what are we going to do about it? What action are we going to take? And this is where I think UCs are going to have the hardest time, because oftentimes with issues of equity and diversity, we only limit ourselves to a conceptual commitment to these issues. We study them in K-12, we study them in third person to other people, but we rarely study them, or if we do study them, we limit it to just the kind of the thought. So we need to move into reflection and then finally action. And that's been a really critical part of the work. So we talk about confronting the equity challenges. And also that this investigation and ongoing inquiry of the racial stratification that we see on our campuses is set in the context of a highly racially stratified educational system. And so the reason why HSIs were first community colleges and CSUs and teaching institutions is because of the historical legacy of exclusion, of excluding and elitism in higher education. You have to be cognizant of that. Doesn't mean you stop there, but you have to think about that in the context of this work. And so what we were seeking to do was to disrupt the institutional intra-racial stratification. So the stratification within our own campus, whether it was in the STEM area, whether it was in how we, faculty hiring. What are the areas where we see this stratification play out on our campuses as a result of lack of opportunity in the historical context that we're in. This was not easy because obviously talking about race can still be difficult, as liberal as you want to consider yourself, and especially when you go from thought to action. That's where there's a lot of trepidation. And so we just hit it head on. We're going to talk about race, and in fact, Estela Ben Simon writes about one of the reasons why, more than 50 years after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, we have made little movement and progress in education around racial disparities in outcomes, even after diversity programs and all kinds of different initiatives. One of the critical pieces she talks about is the muting of race in higher education and education in general is part of the reason we don't see the issues, we don't talk about it. We're not equipped. Sometimes our leaders and our faculty are not trained. The very people responsible for those issues are not given the training and support to address them. And so it's really keeping this focus on disrupting the inequities that happen and thinking of it from the point of disruption as an active thing, not just something we sit back and think about and then continue perpetuating the same practices with the same types of outcomes. We set a vision because we thought it was important. This is not a fully adopted UCSD HSI vision, but we thought it was important to start out by talking about our campus graduating high achieving Latino and all students while we conduct and have sustained inquiry around equity across the academic pipeline. And so we used a benchmark for graduation, which is pretty common, an 80% graduation rate. But we also added a GPA, and I think this is the part that's most important for UC campuses, especially selective UC campuses. Oftentimes, the Latino graduation rate is not going to be that far off from all students or white students. In the UC system, the more selective you become, you're going to see that because we're selecting the best students, they're often going to persist and they will graduate. Now, interestingly enough, in the UC system, there's an inverse relationship between selection and graduation racial gaps. So LA, Berkeley, the most selective UC campuses have the highest graduation gaps, whereas Merced and UC Riverside have closed. They have no graduation gap for Latino students. Have had that for multiple years now. And then Santa Cruz, Santa Barbara, we have narrower gaps than what you'll see in the more selective campuses. I'm not really sure why that exists, but it's pretty clear when you look at the data. And the other issue is we don't know how much how much of the graduation rate and success is a result of how selective and who we admit, or how much of it is it the institution being intentional, as was discussed, intentionally studying and addressing the areas that might contribute to those gaps. And so one of the things that we push is we recommend people look at their predicted graduation rates and using the Harry tool, Harry was mentioned earlier, to see how well you do based on who your students are, and then you use your actual graduation rate to compare how you're doing. And you can do that with Latino students, you can do it with all students. But you need to switch your thinking about graduation rates as the only marker, and also if you don't address selectivity when you're looking at these rates, you're going to be very misled in what you're doing. But why GPA? I want to stick on that point. Once we started getting into the data, and I've been looking at our achievement data for years between EOP and non-EOP students, and one of the things that we found is that non-EOP students, our graduation and retention rates are very similar. We almost have parity for 6-year graduation rates. But if you look at GPAs, you're going to see that at Santa Cruz, more non-EOP students get A's and B's, and more EOP students get B's and C's. So if we're going to claim servingness, it can't just be graduating with a 2.0. It can't be surviving your experience on a campus. It needs to be where you're thriving, where you're at a point where you can go to graduate school, you have career options. And so we put the GPA benchmark, and I think that's where you're going to find most of the racial disparity gaps on your campuses. It's in the achievement. It's what's happening in the classroom. It's going to show up less in the retention and graduation, especially if you compare us to other institutions in California or NCAA division schools. We're always going to look better because of how selective we are. So we have to go beyond that. And if you're not accounting for selectivity, you're giving yourself a false impression of how well you're doing with with populations like Latinx students. So just really think about the GPA, think about the academic achievement. I think that's where you're going to find the largest racial disparity indicators. Not to say we can't do more on retention and graduation, but that's really critical. And then we have a picture of one of the images from the equity scorecard. bringing the data out and having people look at it and understand it has been really essential. This is the practitioner inquiry model that we use. This is from the Engaging the Race Question book by Dowd and Ben Simon. So this is the sustained inquiry, the circle that you have. I know this is really hard to look at. This is the ongoing investigation and looking at the disparities, looking at our belief systems, looking at developing new interventions, and then evaluating them. Every time you do some type of intervention, let's say it's passage rates of a gateway math course, or it could be students going to graduate school, whatever point of intervention that you pick. Every time you do that, you try something. So this requires action, not just thinking about it or reading studies. You evaluate your outcomes, and then you change what you're doing, and so you develop what Ben Simon and Dowd call adaptive expertise. You get better at disrupting the inequity. That leads to better institutional practices and policies, and then that leads to better outcomes. The outcomes are a byproduct of doing better work, and then ultimately you're getting to equalized outcomes. This is a difficult process. It requires a lot of data, as my colleagues said, tons of meetings, way more meetings than you would require. Data sets are not always clean. You have to be persistent. And I think the most important thing is sustained inquiry. How are you set up as a campus to continually investigate and have these inquiry teams set up, as well as coached, because you can hand data, disaggregated data by race, and people don't always know what to do with it. Now, I'll tell you a very common story of how when we disaggregate data for departments, usually we say, so have you looked at your racial disparity gaps, say in Chem 1A or in your major declaration? And most folks say, well, you know, we have this program, we have that program, many which are extramurally funded, they're not even funded by the campus itself. And they say, we don't think we have those issues. And so, well, let's look at the data. And then we'll look at the passage rates, and we'll see pretty large, sizable racial equity gaps. And most faculty that we've met with in departments we've talked to will say, oh my goodness, like, we need to do something about this. What can we do? And usually that's the point where you start thinking about, okay, what are we gonna try differently? But for the most part, what we've found, we've done this with numerous departments, is they have not looked at the data, it has not been maybe central to their planning, and once they identify the issue, they very much want to do something about it. And so coaching people through that process. So it shouldn't just, clearly you can do it at an institutional level with an HSI team, but how do you get this inquiry happening across departments? How do you support it? How do you get people engaged in this type of inquiry? So looking at the data, this is again another slide from a talk that Estela and Simon gave recently at Cabrillo College. And she reminds us that racism is an endemic characteristic of American institutions and is often maintained by illusion of meritocracy. And so I think UC Davis had some myth busting they were doing in their presentation, and thinking about how we're looking at this data and how we can be action oriented. Also looking at they talk about the most difficult things to change are the things that are invisible, the things that are structural. And so really being thoughtful and critical in this work. So on our campus, many of those conversations and meetings and symposia that we had led to thematic areas that emerged. So when we talked about what does it mean to serve a Latino at UC Santa Cruz, or any student for that matter, several things kept emerging. And so they're on the left side. So math came up a lot. Math is critical to equity. Just math is a huge issue both in K-12 and community college. Writing, and particularly writing as it relates to feeling your academic self-concept and how you feel transitioning into academic writing, the schools you went through, sense of belonging, advising, transfer pathways, and faculty professional development. So these areas, through a lot of investigation and a lot of conversations, we essentially defined some of the challenges that we had, things we had to change. And as grant opportunities came up, we used that inquiry as a basis for then saying, we problematize these issues. Now, as a request for proposal came out, we would match between what the Department of Ed wanted to accomplish, what we had already talked about on our campus as things that we needed to address. This list could continue, going down, but these are the ones that kept emerging. And so we have 3 grants, and we've used the thematic areas and the areas we want to work on to drive our grant proposals. So it's not that we went chasing after money and saying, what can we do? There's a request for proposals. In fact, the first 2 years, myself and Juan Poblete, my faculty co-chair from who's a professor of literature, we told folks we're not applying for grants. and we need to stop thinking that it's going to rain money because we hit 25%. I tell people, you should think about bringing your checkbook, not your deposit slip, when it comes to disrupting racial equity on our campus, because it's going to cost us money, time, resources, just as in the Davis presentation was mentioned. And then the other thing that we did is we were fortunate to be 3 for 3 on our grant proposals, but every time we finished a grant proposal, we would say, okay, we did all this data, we figured out research-based interventions, we know what we need to do. So if we don't get this grant, we're gonna do this work with our own money. And we have to figure out how we're gonna get our own money to do this. Because if you really value it, it should come from your resources, not just only when there's a handout from the federal government. So I can't go into all these activities and interventions, but we have one with San Jose City College looking at the transfer pathways where we're a sub-awardee. You don't have to hit the 25% to be a partner on a community college's HSI grant, so that may be a good starting point, talking to your community college partners to see how you can be a 4-year partner. Oh, excuse me. Okay. So again, I won't go into all the areas. I'm going to talk a little bit about our STEM data analysis. We developed a conceptual map of what was happening on our campus as a result of the inequitable opportunities and outcomes. So when we were looking at our STEM work, we first began to look at STEM intended students at UC Santa Cruz, defined as they put that on their major, they declared it when they were applying, or the course taking pattern. So these are students who attempted pre-calculus and a combination with chemistry 1A, which is a very common first year course. So these are students who by course taking pattern said, I'm a STEM student. And we realized we have a lot of STEM students, both Latinx and other communities. We don't have to convince people to go into STEM if we want to increase our STEM production. That's what the Department of Ed is always asking. But we saw through time, if you think of those STEM students in that blue shaded area, as they move on, we have STEM attrition into other majors. They may not return. And the biggest loss is in the foundational coursework. And it's not surprising, considering some of these courses are designed as weeding out courses. That's actually how people talk about, these courses. And so we knew we had to develop interventions that increased STEM persistence. So the students who are repeating a STEM foundational course for the second time, students who are on the cusp of really being interested but not being able to make the major declaration. And the unfortunate part is on our campus, and I'm sure on many campuses, these outcomes and this process is highly racialized. And that's the part that was more invisible to the campus. And so here's an analysis of grades disaggregated, this white students in blue, Latino in orange. And you can see across many different areas, and I don't know if I have a pointer here, but you can see you have writing 2 on the end. That's kind of just a reference point in terms of context.
Play with a pad.
Okay. Well, you can see that we could identify the courses. So that dotted line is a 2.0 in terms of a grade scale, where we had Latinx students failing at the higher rates, where we had issues. So this was kind of a first scan of looking at where are the issues and where do we need to make a difference if we want to increase and not have students facing STEM attrition. A further analysis looked at the courses, and we saw there were 3 major courses that if we could address, if we could just improve the passing and performance in these 3 areas. So this is a heat map disaggregated by race with white and Latino students, that it was chemistry 1A, bio 20A, and math 3. And so then we got into developing proposals and looking at how are we teaching the course, what kind of pre-course information is offered, how are they doing overall, are sections required, are the TAs trained in these particular areas. Here's another look of the fall 12 incoming cohort. One of the things that we looked at, we wanted to test, and this is true outside of biology as well, of the students who are STEM intended, after they've been in the foundational coursework into their junior year, how many of them qualified versus didn't qualify. And you can see that more African American students didn't qualify than were able to declare that major. You can see the Asian numbers are, again, slightly different. White students and Latino students are in the inverse, in that more white students declared than did not qualify, and for Latino students it was the exact opposite. And so, again, a lot of folks had thought some of this was going on, but had not actually looked at it, and then said, okay, how many more students do we have to reach and support in order to have parity or to eliminate the racial disparity. And I'm going to switch a little bit because I wanted, this is from a earlier report, and I think this phenomenon captures really well what we see happening in the UC system, which is where we have this rise in undergraduate enrollment, and we need to include but not stay at the undergraduate level. You can see faculty and executive positions have remained flat over the same period, which means that as we increase our numbers, our students will not be taking courses with people who look like them, with people who share similar perspectives culturally. And so this is going to be really key, and I think earlier the UC postdoctoral program was mentioned. One area where as a campus in the UC system, and especially UC Berkeley, but all the UCs can contribute, is we need to diversify the faculty in higher education, period. So given that there's so few R1 HSI institutions, this is an area where I think we can give back, that we be very intentional and put resources into producing faculty of color across the state, within the UC system, we need it as well, but across the segment to help transform higher education and the governance of higher education overall. And then again, more work to do in the executive level as well. These numbers have really not changed over time. So this is, again, another view that this was mentioned earlier, slightly different. Well, it's still the Gina Garcia quadrant. I like to use it as well. Because I think UCs are already Latinx producing, or what she calls Latinx producing. So the outcomes in terms of academic indicators from low to high, and then the cultural indicators going from left to right. We have high academic outcomes because of our selectivity. And so any UC that becomes an HSI is already going to be producing Latinx graduates. The question is, and where we're going to need a lot more help, and there were some indicators shared in Anne-Marie's talk around the cultural components. What does it mean culturally to be a Hispanic Serving Institution? And I think this is something where we can help define what that is, but we need to take a very hard look at ourselves. To move from Latinx producing to Latinx serving, we have a lot more work to be, for Latinx students to see themselves reflected culturally in our institution. So whether that's in the curriculum, whether it's in the faculty, with their teaching assistants, etc. So I think this is the area that I would say, as you develop your plan moving forward, don't just pay attention to academic outcomes, especially because you're UC Berkeley and you're in the selectivity. You have to look at both and look at those together. Some of the questions I was thinking about, partially from presentations, also from attending the UC Davis talk, and kind of also reflecting on our experience at Santa Cruz. So I would say R1s need to take this HSI opportunity and make it consequential for racial equity as through sustained inquiry and leadership. So that's the investigation coupled with the action and making the investments and changes that need to be made to try to change those outcomes. We are leaders in research, but we're not always leaders in critical action research in terms of looking at ourselves and doing first-person research, investigating ourselves and making changes. So this is kind of the same idea of going beyond the conceptual commitment. And how do we do that? How do we enact that? I already talked about producing faculty of color. This is a place where I think R1s can contribute to the HSI broader community, whereas CSUs or teaching institutions and community colleges can't readily as do. I mentioned the culture component as well, and then also a question of what is it or should it mean to have racial equity at UC Berkeley? You have to grapple with racial equity as you look at what it means to be an HSI, and then also what practices, structures, knowledge, competencies do we need to have in order to successfully engage in this inquiry coupled with action. So I would strongly think about that. These are a couple of books that have been extremely helpful. We have one of the authors right here in the audience. It has been fundamental. This has been like required reading for our HSI team. So I highly, highly recommend it. That's it.
Wow, this is super exciting for me, I have to be honest. Thank you, Laura, for the invite, and I want to thank the campus for the opportunity to be part of this historic conversation. When I was a student here, I have to say I did not imagine this kind of venue. So it's very exciting for me. I'm going to talk about some of the big vision and operational aspects that we have done. In my role at UCI, a lot of the work that I do has been focused on transitioning the campus not only to a Hispanic Serving Institution, but in the broader sense to a minority serving institution. And again, to be frank, as I do that, I think that a big part of what I rely on has been my training in ethnic studies here at Berkeley. So thank you. So let me see, how do I... So the first slide here, I just have the new UCI strategic plan, and I know this is somewhat dry, but for me in my role, it's very critical because some of the strategies listed for ensuring that students are advancing, ensuring that students are prepared to be future leaders, ensuring that student experience is elevated. Listed in there is transitioning the campus to become a Hispanic Serving Institution and an Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander Serving Institution. Also, as we look forward to the, as Pablo was mentioning, towards broadening the professoriates, we partner with a number of different minority serving institutions. For example, there is the UC HBCU initiative. We do a number of partnerships to expand participation in grad school. And I also want to say, since Blas brought it all up, it does say there completion of UCI into a Hispanic Serving Institution, but I've come to understand that to be maintained, because as you can see, Blas is all over getting the students that we need. So, in anticipation of HSI designation, the first thing we did was to have a task force. And the task force had a broad base of administrators across campus. And I mean, in one sense, the questions reflect a debate between the asset and deficit model. Because the findings, no matter how they land on the ground, you're going to have to advocate for how you want to implement them. So these questions are very, very, very basic, and we're very, very fundamental. Asking who are our Latinx students? Where are they coming from? Well, how can we meet them? Is the campus serving them well? Right? What are the gaps? And third, how can we improve? I mean, again, these are very basic questions, and it is somewhat just of a first step, right? We just want to know how are our students doing on campus, and where do we need to improve? Some of the select findings were retention within the initial majors. There was a huge migration. The vast majority of students came in STEM. Of course, for a number of different reasons, years 1 and 2, they migrated out to social sciences, humanities. Obviously, if that's a choice, right? If that's the student's desire, that's fine. But we have the assumption that there are other structural issues going on. And this goes as well to the faculty governance and thinking about ways to transform the culture. And I do need to say as well, with those questions up there, the way we approach this is not just something that is for URMs on campus. It's not just Latinx folks that have to be responsible for this. This is everybody's responsibility. And the fact that this is in our strategic plan means that it's mandated, in a sense. All right? It's not something that I show up and say, oh, please, I hope you can help me with this. If there's an issue, I say, hey, maybe we should talk to the chancellor or the provost. So this is critical, right? So the first finding, that high migration, changing majors. Why? The second, Significant lack of coordination. I mean, UCI, in my experience, is like no other UC. It has 12 schools, maybe 13, and it's like a federation, right? Each school has its sort of own dean, has its own dean and its own governing situation. So you have no College of Letters and Science. You have School of Biological Sciences, School of Physical Sciences, School of Humanities, School of Social Science. I mean, it goes on and on and on. So it can be very complicated. So coordinating so that students have multiple on-ramps is a challenge. Now, another aspect of that is, one of the major findings was that without coordination, students are left to self-advocate. And having been a transfer student myself, you know, just being dropped on a campus one day, I have a sense of what that's like, right? It's not easy. So this is very important. And third, I mean, UCI is somewhat new, 1965. I was able to uncover an EOP video from the early 1970s and compare it to a video that we produced recently, and it's shocking, right? So finding ways to identify and recognize Latinx cultural capital on campus so that students don't feel groundless. They have to have some sense of depth and history on campus. So, on building on those recommendations, right? I mean, those are just ideas. Of course, we have to act. So, in the first case, with respect to migration, right? I need to understand what is going on. And this isn't, of course, to be a STEM-centric person, right? I mean, I have a social science background, but I do know that culturally right now, STEM is where it's at for many students. And the vast majority of our Latinx students enter in STEM. So what is going on there, right? Trying to understand that, we pursued an NSF HSI grant, and we were awarded that grant. And the focus was pathways in and out of STEM for Latinx students. We had a number of different observations and findings, some of which were similar to what Pablo was showing, the gateway courses that students need the most attention. With respect to the second item there, Latino Excellence and Achievement Dinner. So that was the result of us trying to advance, identify, promote Latinx cultural capital. That particular event, as far as we know, is the first in the system to celebrate Latinx graduate excellence. So we organized an event where we had all the schools identify students that are performing at a high level, and of course this was another way of pushing the bill, so to speak, at the graduate level, forcing those schools to look around and see if they have Latinx students. There are some schools that since we're being recorded, there's some schools that we wanted to push it. We want your nomination for your highest performing Latinx graduate student. And so last year was the first year we did that. This year, apparently because it was so successful, we have the Chancellor doing the opening remarks this year. And also we have Regent and Chancellor Eloy Ortiz Oakley, who's also a UCI alum, giving the keynote. And of course he will discuss the pipeline, right, to the professoriate and its significance. So this event for us was a way to make students who were feeling that they had been overlooked and in this massive federation of schools disjointed and not connected in any way, shape, or form. And the last thing there, the CalTeach, that was a way of bringing together different, a way of improving coordination. CalTeach is a well-known program, but in this case it's between School of Biological Sciences, Physical Science, and Education at UCI. And this was a way to elevate that coordination. CalTeach specifically is for math and science majors who, if participating in this program, you can do a teaching credential as well. So we received a Department of Education HSI Title V grant for that. So in other words, we use the recommendations to identify action items, in a sense, right? And these are just some examples. And so, I mean, I've spoken about, right, oops, actually I wanted to go back one. How do I go back?
The up arrow.
Actually, this is the most important thing for me. I say add because we use that at Haku on the side. For us, HSI designation, I mean, we view it as somewhat of, I mean, it's a federal construct. It's 25%. As I understand it, it has no correlation to reality outside of the fact that it was the product of compromise between politicians. So for us, it is what it is, right? It's a 25% designation, 25% demographic that enables you to be eligible for HSI grants and is focused on undergraduate students. For us, when we think about it, we want to think much broader. For us, HSI is something that permeates all levels of the campus's ecosystem. For us, HSI initiatives are not simply something for undergraduates, which is critical, but we think about it in terms of how can we better serve our graduate students? How can we better serve staff? How can we better serve faculty, or I should say, if you've seen the numbers, how can we transform the faculty? How can we involve the community? It's not something that we limit to that 25% federal definition. That's very, very important for us. So you could say that our HSI-ness, our identity as an HSI, is definitely not something that begins and ends with a grant. Whether or not we have a grant, we like to imagine that it is something that goes way beyond that, way beyond the 25%. And we are also an ANAPISI, an Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander Serving Institution. And as I mentioned earlier, that too was in the strategic plan. And we likewise completed an ANAPISI task force report, similar in nature. Who are API students? How are they doing? Is the campus serving them well? We do also have an ANAPISI grant, Decade Plus. This particular grant is focused on pipelining undergraduates into grad school and giving grad students the necessary experience they would need to be mentors as in the professoriate. Now, what's critical about this is that this is an ANAPISI grant, but there are numerous, in fact, I would say many Latinx students who also participate in this grant. It's not as though you need to be showing a particular identification card to participate. As far as Department of Education is concerned, you just need to be serving underserved students. And so we have many Latinx students participating in the Decade Plus program. And now our HSI grant is somewhat new. I assume there will be many API students likewise participating in that CalTeach grant. So in other words, in my mind, they work together. And that goes towards us envisioning ourselves as an MSI campus, a minority serving institution campus. One of the other things that really struck us in terms of thinking about how those two reports helped us to think about who we are as an institution was how many institutions how many minority serving institutions are in the AAU? And this is critical. This has been brought up today, right? In terms of HSI, as far as I know, there's Santa Barbara, there's us, and Davis. Davis is in, Davis has, right? So there are 60 in the AAU, 2 in Canada, right? There are, maybe, I've heard different numbers, over 500 HSIs, and you have 3 that are in the AAU. With respect to ANAPISI, it's similar. There are only 2 active ANAPISIs in the AAU. Now, these are the elite research institutions in the nation. There's us, there is University of Minnesota, and University of Maryland College Park was at one time, but their grant ran out. So in other words, it's very just, there are not many elite research institutions that are also minority serving institutions. In my mind, this is one of the best, my favorite aspects of my job, which is pushing that narrative about what counts as academic excellence. What counts? which students belong at academically and in AAU institutions. Likewise, disaggregation was critical. In the NAPZ report, as I was doing it, I learned that we have 23 different categories that we disaggregate through the UC application within for AAPIs. Unfortunately, Latinx has, I think, 6 categories, but they're not as useful because the AAPI categories were the product of student activism in the 2000s. Students demanded to be counted through the Count Me In campaign. And so when we looked at who our AAPI students are, we had 23 different indicators. And of course, you know, the intent, I mean, it's sad to say, was to take on the model minority myth. It's hard to believe that that still persists. But it showed that there was a bimodal population on campus. There were some students that were exceptional. In the aggregate, you could see AAPI students were at the top or tied. But when you disaggregate, you see many students that are at or below URM values. So we can't really know how to serve our students unless we know who they are. And this is a cluster analysis of student performance. The blue is URM values. The green, we can't really see, is above the mean, and whatever color that is, I'm not sure, is right about the mean. But the point is, when you disaggregate, you see all in the blue area, the different AAPI students that are not performing at the so-called model minority myth level. It's critical to know. It would be nice if we could disaggregate Latinx as well. It would be nice. And I just want to say that this is part of a larger ongoing comprehensive data analytics project on campus called Compass. It involves descriptive analytics, predictive analytics, and to some extent prescriptive, which I'm not sure about the politics of that yet. But I think that for us, HSI, ANAPZ, partnerships with different MSIs go hand in hand. It's critical. That is something that we have had in our strategic plan, and something we have acted on and tried to realize. Now, I was also asked to maybe take a little discussion about this from the point of view of an alum, and I'm going to take off. I want to take off my role as a representative from UCI. Because some of these, I don't know if they're a little too pointed or not. So I want to say I'm just an alum now. Let's see if these. Yes. So I'm just going to read these. Right. These are questions from my experience that I'm asking. I'm asking the campus. Who will determine what HSI means at Berkeley? HSI is a federal construct based on an arbitrary demographic requirement of 25% Latinx undergraduates. Will the campus develop a more expansive campus-based definition that extends beyond federal criteria? Why would you limit yourself to that Hispanic 25% criteria? Berkeley is a pathbreaker in critical race and ethnic studies. In that same spirit, will the campus pursue dual designation as an HSI and ANAPZ? Will the campus build capacity to partner with other MSIs? This is something I ask, not to reproduce, as people would say in the department, the so-called 4 food groups, but something that's critical to think about. The campus has an amazing foundation and is a pathbreaker. Why wouldn't you do that? And again, this is an alum, not as a person from UCI. Third, what will it mean when Berkeley, a founding member of the prestigious AAU, becomes an MSI? It has the potential to rock the foundation of what it means to be an elite research institution, from my mind. So of course, I have there the Third Liberation Front strike, right? And I think about the correlation right? It isn't, and there is not an exact correlation between Third World Liberation Front Strike and the current UC MSI movement, but there are similarities. Both had intense engagement with diversification of faculty and curriculum, right? In some sense, when I think about HSI at Berkeley, from the point of view of Third World Liberation Front Strike, at 150 years old, is Berkeley Latinx enrolling or Latinx serving? Now, the bottom thing is somewhat in the weeds, because all of this has been high-level, visionary, but this other thing called the eligibility matrix, which I know Blas knows about and I know Pablo knows about, you're not going to get anywhere unless you play that education game. I took a look at the eligibility matrix. Berkeley has a little bit of work to do in terms of Pell students in order to meet the requirements. Likewise, you're going to need to meet the core expenses. I know the HSI division director, Beatriz is an alum of, she's a banana slug. She says no UC will ever be never be eligible in that area. That's what she says. But the point is, there are ways to apply for a waiver. And there are schools in here, because I looked at the matrix, that had a much harder time, had a much harder time than I believe Berkeley would have. So I know that that can be done. So those are just some things that I think about as an alum. And now putting back on my other hat, I'm going to say, in closing, I again thank you for this opportunity to participate in this what I think of as a historic conversation. And also, I just want to say that I look forward to seeing Berkeley rock the foundation of what counts as an elite research institution. Thank you.
So, as Juan said, we're all going to break out into different groups and consider what does it mean for Cal to become an HSI. And so we have developed a couple of prompts of questions. And the first that we're going to ask you all to think about is how would you create, tailor, or sustain a Hispanic serving culture to support the current and future profile of the student body at Cal? So you have a lot of input from the past few sessions. And then what would be the specific roles of different actors across different levels of leadership at your institution? Governing boards, presidents, deans, staff. Who might take on these different roles? And then the 5 areas that we're going to ask you to think about, and these have all been covered today. The first is revamping outreach, recruitment, yield, and marketing. The second is developing admissions policies and processes. The third is enhancing the student experience, so like improving climate, sense of belonging. The fourth is garnering support within and outside the Latinx campus community. And the fifth is the sustainability, how to maintain gains beyond the 25% enrollment benchmark. And we're going to give you handouts that articulate these questions, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what you'll be asked to reflect on. And then toward the end, we'll ask you all to report back your ideas in these 5 areas.
Just as you go into these groups, think about what we've heard today. We've heard really great insight about how becoming an HSI is not an additive element, but really integratively addresses the institutional shortcomings that we have to really serve our Latinx community here on campus and the ones who aren't here yet, right? So how do we think about from this grassroots, on the ground perspective, what do you think we should do here? Right? What does it mean? So these things worked at UC Davis, these things worked at UC Santa Cruz, at UCI, at UCLA, nationally, what that looks like. What does that mean here? What's possible? How do we push beyond, our imagination of what we thought has been possible and how we serve Latinx students, and really push forward these recommendations, which will then be compiled here at the center and shared with the broader university community. So really push that imagination. These are early conversations. Think not just like what you want to see at the end, but what that process should be along the way. Does it look like a task force with a $40,000 budget? Does it look like multiple task forces? Does it look like not a task force but ongoing committees? Think through what do you think that should look like from your different perspective on campus, and recognizing that this is a space that honors your expertise and your insight as valued members of this community.
Thank you. And I just want to add one thing, that as we think about what are the statistics here on campus, Andrew Epic, who works at the Institute, the Institutional Resource Analyst for Equity and Inclusion, just gave us some updated figures. For fall 2018, undergraduates are at 14.7%. Remember, we have over 20,000 undergraduate students. We have over 25,000 undergraduate students. The graduate students are at 7.7% out of under 10,000 graduate students. And the faculty are at 5.6%, a figure that has stayed almost the same for the last 6 years, out of 1,500 ladder-ranked faculty. And our staff is at 13% out of about 8,500 staff. So these are our numbers.
And remember, it's not about the numbers necessarily, but what the institutional practices and policies and biases that inform what those numbers look like, right? Which is what you all are tackling. So here are the room breakouts. We understand that there are a lot of people who fit within multiple categories, in particular alumni.